Thank you very much to George and to Edward. You may have heard there's a general election occurring at the moment, and when I accepted this speaking invitation, there wasn't. Now, I've got various jobs to do during the election in Paul Nuttall's advisor, economic spokesman again now for UKIP, likely to be standing in a seat, just 3 of the hats. But although I cleared my diary of non-party events, this was the one that stayed in, because I wanted to come along to say thank you to everyone in the campaign for an independent Britain, which is by any measure the daddy of all Brexit campaigns and movements. Been there, I think, right at the start, probably doesn't go far enough, even before we were actually formally dragged in. And I thought George spoke very movingly there of the terrible wrong that was done to this country, to our democracy, to our monarchy and our sovereignty by Edward Heath and his cohorts. I would not accuse him of deliberate act of treachery. I'm sure he was well motivated as someone who served in the Second World War and then swallowed the propaganda, the idea that destroying all the nation states in Europe was the only way to stop them waging war on each other. But nonetheless, it was a terrible act of political trickery and lying, at least by omission, that dragged us in the first place, and dragged us in without a referendum, and the referendum only being held once the other side had stolen away the status quo. Now, we'll be leaving, won't we, approximately, I think, on the 50th birthday of the CIB, so I hope there's a very good birthday party arranged. Now, when I was a teenager, one of my favourite novels was a novel called A Kind of Loving, which you may remember was made into a British film and then a TV series as well. Well, it's actually a trilogy, and the final part of the trilogy by Stan Barstow is called The Right True End. And I hope we're going to get to, and think we are going to get to, the right true end for a cause that many people in this room have given virtually their whole adult lives to. And not many people in the media, in the chattering classes, in the political establishment ever gave the slightest credence to the idea that people battling to get our democracy back, to take us out of this supranational, embryonic superstate would ever be successful. I don't think it even occurred to the establishment parties and politicians until David Cameron was forced to offer that referendum in his Bloomberg speech in, was it January 2013? It never even occurred to them there was the slightest possibility of us winning our various different people's armies, not just the UKIP one. But that's what we did, and we've had the most amazing progress. If you think even a year ago, we were still in the era of Dave. We were still in the era of the Prime Minister campaigning to keep us in the European Union, along with the leaderships of the other main parliamentary parties. It was taken as read, almost as a foregone conclusion, that Remain was going to win the referendum. A couple of years ago, perhaps some of us would have bitten people's hands off if given the option of the so-called Norway arrangement as a stepping stone to full independence. Well, now it's the other side, isn't it? It's the Remainers whose pipe dream is something like the Norway option, and as long as we're vigilant, they're not going to get it. So we will certainly be, as Paul Nuttall says, the guard dogs of Brexit in the coming years, but also I think we need to be vigilant but not paranoid, and as the saying goes, let's not make the best the enemy of the good. I do think, I'm confident we're on course for getting a Brexit which passes the common sense, ordinary patriotic person's test of restoring our country to the realms of self-governing democracies. And that is the most fantastic achievement. You know, there are politicians who've sat in the highest offices in the land and in the back of many a ministerial limousine and been lauded in establishment circles, who've never achieved anything even a tenth as good as we in this room have achieved through our collective efforts. And I don't know what will happen to me. I'm looking forward to the last day in the European Parliament. Hopefully we'll have some kind of reverse Hong Kong ceremony where this time we get our flag and our sovereignty back. I may go back into the media or do something else altogether, but I will never regret the years fighting for Brexit. And I must say, in terms of most people in this room, I am certainly a relative newcomer to the battle, and I apologise for being a slow learner. I hadn't really worked out that we absolutely had to leave the EU until probably about some time in 2009, and before that I think I measured my Euroscepticism, as did many people, by complete opposition to us joining the Euro. Although I should say, I think that winning that battle not to join the Euro, and I pay tribute to James Goldsmith and others for his role in that, was absolutely an essential building block to the great referendum victory we enjoyed last year. Well, we were written off, weren't we, as a fringe element. They called us Europhobes, Little Englanders, and the idea that we commanded mainstream support was treated by most of the media and the political class as a joke. Well, guess what? It turns out our views were rather popular. They command a majority of opinion, and we now have a Prime Minister and a governing party apparently fully signed up to Brexit. So this has been an absolutely magnificent achievement by everyone. Sometimes in speeches like this, if a speaker is desperate for an early round of applause, he says to the audience, "Give yourself a round of applause." So I urge you now to do that. Well done, everyone. Yes, so we now have a Prime Minister in Theresa May who has pledged that we will be leaving the single market, that we will leave the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, although there may be a few twists in that particular pledge, and end untrammelled free movement, taking back our full sovereignty over our borders. UKIP set out our 6 tests for Brexit a few weeks ago when we did not realise there was going to be a general election because the Prime Minister had promised there wouldn't be, well, and said it wasn't in the national interest indeed. Well, I wonder what it is about opinion polls showing her 20 points ahead of the Labour Party that changed her view of what the national interest really was. But anyway, we set out what we think were 6 key common sense priorities, not a comprehensive list, but the main things we will look for her to achieve and the government to deliver in Brexit. And the first test was a legal test, where we say Parliament must resume its supremacy of lawmaking with no impediments, qualifications or restrictions on its future actions agreed in any leaving deal. We must remove ourselves from the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. And then we had a final point that no undertaking should be given in the leaving agreement that constrained the UK to being an ongoing member of the European Court of Human Rights. Now, I'm sure everyone in the room will know that technically membership of the European Court of Human Rights is a Council of Europe institution. It's not strictly to do with the EU, although the EU has taken out corporate membership. But we would certainly object to any undertaking in our departure which signed us up to that. You may have seen some newspaper headlines this week where Theresa May had talked about pulling out of the jurisdiction of the European Court and is now content not to. Well, that's not so much our objection, but she mustn't say or give any undertaking on behalf of the nation in our leaving the European Union, which constrains us to still have bow to legal supremacy from a foreign court. Then our second test was the migration test. Britain must resume full control of its immigration and asylum policies and border controls. There must be no impediments, qualifications or restrictions agreed in any leaving deal. We must not be bound by any freedom of movement obligation. The departure terms must facilitate the government finally making good on its broken promise to cut annual net migration to the tens of thousands. I think that's fairly clear. And I think we surprised a few people by putting in a maritime test, particularly aimed at helping our coastal communities and our fishing industry. But I think nobody could dispute if there was one industry and one group of people who were most badly betrayed by the terms on which we joined, it was our fishing industry, it was our coastal communities, where our great maritime resources, our exclusive economic zone, was turned into a common European Union resource. So we must get back our full maritime sovereignty and our full exclusive economic zone stretching 200 miles off the coast, or if you like, to the halfway line between us and the countries over the other side of the North Sea and the English Channel. And we will, in UKIP, we will make a particular point of fighting for our fishing industries because they've been betrayed once before by a Conservative Prime Minister. And I don't think it takes an overly cynical person to worry that some kind of concession to a more powerful industry, perhaps the City of London, might be pocketed by this government in return for selling out our fishing industry once again. And we'll be kicking up the most enormous stink if that should happen. We set out a trade test. The UK must retake its seat on the World Trade Organization, resuming its right to sign trade agreements with other countries. We must have full legal rights to set our own tariff and non-tariff barriers consistent with WTO rules, and that means leaving the single market and customs union. And we think we can certainly offer continued tariff-free trade with no strings attached to the EU, but if the EU declines, then WTO terms are the acceptable fallback position, and post-departure, both sides would have the opportunity to further liberalise trade on the basis of mutual gain. So we don't think there's anything to be scared of to walk away having not signed a deal with the EU and switch to WTO terms. We don't see it like the BBC describes it as, quotes, crashing out without a deal. And in fact, there's a very strong case to be made, given the balance of trade between us and the EU, that actually they have far, far more to lose than we do, and in the short term there would be a Treasury revenue gain from WTO level tariffs, which could actually be used to compensate our citizens for any slight price increases on imported goods. So the panic over this deal, I think, which the BBC is stoking up again today, only serves to lessen the leverage of the United Kingdom in these negotiations. And I'd like to see the BBC make a programme setting out why we have absolutely nothing to fear from leaving without an agreement and moving to WTO terms. Then we set out a money test. There must be no final settlement payment to the EU and no ongoing payments to the EU budget after we've left. Thank you. And we must also reclaim our share of financial assets from entities such as the European Investment Bank, in which it's estimated some £9 billion of UK money is vested. When we leave the club, why should we go on paying a membership fee? We've paid net a huge sum of money since we were in. There's nothing. I think the House of Lords had a report which said there was no legally enforceable way of making the United Kingdom pay a penny in future to an organisation of which it was no longer a member. And then there's the final test was the time test, and this has slightly been altered by Theresa May calling the election. We said that given David Cameron had held the referendum so early in the government's term, it was clearly reasonable to expect the Brexit process to be completed well before the next general election. Well, clearly that's not now going to happen because it won't be a 2020 election, but I think we can still stick to our timetable, which we said Brexit must be done and dusted before the end of 2019. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to ask, with Article 50, her preferred way of leaving, now having been triggered. So the election has been called, and UKIP had a big decision to make. Do we fight every seat as an independent political party? Do we stand aside in every single seat where an MP supported Brexit in the referendum? Do we stand aside in every single seat where MPs who supported Remain now say they support Brexit even? It's a difficult choice to make, because as a political party, when you don't stand in a significant number of seats, that's one of the things that the broadcasters measure whether you still count as a major political party by. So every seat we don't stand in knocks one off that total, knocks our possible share of the vote that we can achieve, even in this difficult political context, and really hampers us for the next 5 years ahead, at least, in terms of how many times UKIP will be invited on Question Time and other political debate programmes, for example. So UKIP has decided to put country before party, but we really have set a reasonably high bar. We're not going to be standing aside for legions of what we refer to as 5 to midnight Brexiteers, people who made a calculation in the weeks before the referendum that perhaps their career path was best served by coming down on one side or the other. But we have announced that we won't stand, for instance, against Philip Hollowbone. I think that's the Kettering seat, and Philip worked very closely with UKIP before the referendum and during it. And I can tell you that just an hour or two ago, we announced we are not going to stand against Stuart Jackson in Peterborough either. And I've had quite a role in reaching that decision with our branch. And with Stuart, he resigned from a PPS ship in October 2011 in order to vote against a three-line whip in support of holding an in-out referendum. And since then, he's campaigned vigorously for one and campaigned alongside me and other UKIP people in Peterborough during the referendum, where we achieved a 61% outvote. It wasn't one of the very highest in the country, but it was the sort of bellwether seat where a good win set us on our way. So with Stuart having a majority of less than 2,000 over Labour, we thought there is no point standing against him and risking bringing a Remainer back into the House of Commons instead of a good Brexiteer. And that will cost us again. We had 7,000 votes at the general election, but we are prepared, as we have been in the past, to use that phrase from the sports field, to take one for the team in this election. We really, I didn't want there to be a general election, and when some people in the Sceptic movement did, to really seize an extra mandate, but I thought the risk of contaminating the mandate from the referendum, if the Remain parties did exceptionally well, was a terrible risk to take. We had our victory. We seemed to have sufficient political impetus to deliver that before an election would be called at the end. Now, Theresa May's gone down a different path, and even though I'm a cautious person, it seems to me, touching wood here, that there is very, very little prospect of parties dedicated to Remain winning a majority in the House of Commons on June the 8th. And we haven't seen what the Labour Party will say in their manifesto, and they seem to bounce around on this issue all over the place, don't they? And I would never trust them, but I think even the Labour Party aren't going to come up with an explicit, anti-Brexit position in the manifesto that they could use as a subsequent mandate in the extremely unlikely event of them being the largest party in the House of Commons. Clearly, the Liberal Democrats have seen a little niche of ardent pro-EU opinion, and they will come out with an explicit anti-Brexit position. But it seems that we're set fair to return a government in the House of Commons with a clear majority that's going to be pledging Brexit and will bound its supporters and its MPs by a Brexit manifesto. So I think we will, I assume, wake up on June the 9th with the Brexit process actually cemented more firmly in place rather than less firmly. Now, leaving the European Union for me, and I suspect for a majority of people in this room, was all about democracy and sovereignty. And I don't accept the idea that there was anything intrinsically right-wing about Euroscepticism. Obviously, in the early days, there were probably the Labour Party was the predominant arena of support for Euroscepticism, and back in the 1970s, the Conservative Party was the pro-EU party indeed. And when we do leave, UKIP, I think, is going to carry on, and UKIP has identified several other major issues it wishes to campaign on, not least the problems with social disintegration and the need to integrate and have British values, core British values, universally acknowledged and observed in our country. Values like being equal before the law, gender equality and freedom of expression. And I personally think that will be the next really big, profound battle over the state of Britain to protect our ancient liberties. So UKIP is going to certainly carry on. And why I say there was nothing right-wing about Euroscepticism is I, for one, profoundly believe in the power of the collective entity. I'm not an ultra-libertarian by any means. I think a very important question is who are we? When we refer to we, what do we mean? And very few people in the United Kingdom, when thinking of who are we, ever thought, well, we are the European Union. The European identity is part of our collective identity, but it's a rather weak part. And indeed, before those marches from people in North London got going after they lost the referendum, I had never heard anybody in this country chanting for Europe outside the Ryder Cup once every 2 years. And I think anyone who knows the golf-going public would realise that those chants for Europe were not for the European Union. I would like to finish on this thought to the Remain people who now feel that they're the excluded ones, that we are becoming, believe it or not, the establishment, and they're the ones now going on marches with their flags and banners and holding meetings in dusty halls on Sunday evenings. I actually think if that's their ideal and that's what they want to campaign for, then fair play to them. And they say they want a second referendum. Well, of course, we all know that we've already had the second referendum, and that was back in June. But if we discount the referendum in 1975, my message to the Remainers, or the Ramoners as some people call them, is by all means campaign for another referendum. You'll need to organise, you'll need to campaign, you'll need to show energy, you'll need to have good fortune, and the worst thing probably is it will take you about 40 years if the EU still exists, which it won't. Thank you very much.